Mental health is a topic that's relevant to all of us, and certainly workers are not excluded. In this conversation, we explore the complexities of mental well-being, from understanding how different circumstances impact our mental health to navigating the challenges of stigma and access to care. I have as my guest today on the Workers Podcast, Feona Richards, clinical psychologist and mental health professional. Feona, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Awesome. So I'll start by asking you this. Let's talk a bit about the progress that has been made so far as normalizing mental health discussions. Because you'd think that it's something that a lot of people have been acclimatized to when you compare it to periods prior. We even have a song this carnival about mental health, right?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. So tell us about the progress that we've made so far.
I think that we've come a long way for Antigua and Barbuda in terms of normalizing discussion, as you so rightly said, because most people now recognize that there are things that they once thought that was normal that may not necessarily be quite as they once thought. Yeah. And so a lot of persons have started developing help-seeking behavior, or even having those conversations with persons that they trust. And very often we find more persons, fostering more or better help-seeking behaviors, even though it's not at the level we would love it to be. Yeah. We have seen a significant increase in persons being more open to ask for help.
Mm-hmm. Okay, sounds good. Now, let's look at another question. Mental health versus mental illness. Mm-hmm. Is there a difference? And if so, what is the difference?
Yes, there's a difference. So mental health is just basically your state of well-being. How well are you functioning? How well are you sleeping? How well are you eating? How well you're adjusting to different aspects or changes in your life? How are you adapting to that? Are you easily adapting to those things or those changes? Now, mental illness is when we are not adapting to those changes. We lost someone we loved. We lost a job, the end of a relationship, we lost some money, we got into an accident, we got sick. What happens after all those things have happened to a person? How does a person function after? Now, if a person is able to get a job, be able to function, and when I say function, it means showing up for work on time, meeting deadlines, it means dressing appropriately, self-care. Those are the things that tells me that a person is adjusting or adapting.
Okay.
Now, if a person is constantly saying that they're tired, if a person is indicating that they're not eating, etc., not sleeping, those are red flags. And most likely there is some abnormality happening within the brain, because mental illness is a brain condition. Right? It's an imbalance of chemicals within the brain. We don't talk about that part enough because there is a biology behind mental illness. So we could spend a whole day talking about that. However, it's what happens when we get stressed, when we're not adjusting to the different changes in life, that we may be fixated on a situation. So for persons who may have lost a loved one, we may say, okay, a month, 3 months. For you to go through not wanting to talk to anybody, shut down. But beyond that 3 months now, we start saying you are experiencing what is called complicated grief. Mm-hmm. And that in itself is a mental health issue.
Yeah.
Right? And we say that is a mental illness. And then that in itself, if a person does not take care or seek help, then we have a person becoming depressed or developing some other type of mental illness. So the illness is a diagnosis that is given for a person's inability to adjust or adapt based on a chemical imbalance within their bodies.
Okay. Interesting. Now, what are some of the things, and we'll come back to mental health now, what are some of the things that may contribute to poor mental health?
So as I was saying before, losing somebody you love, that's a huge thing. Because if that person was a person who believed in you, encouraged you, etc., and then this person who has basically been your whole life is no longer there, then you're going to feel sad. But how long is it normal for you to feel sad? Okay. When we become stressed, our bodies produce different types of chemicals depending on if we are in the fight, flight, or freeze aspect. Some of us walking around with bellies, especially us women, we store cortisol on our abdomens. And guess what? Cortisol is a chemical that is higher in persons with depression. So once you're feeling stressed, there's no movement, you're not doing anything to care about yourself or take care about yourself. So you're not walking, you're not eating right, you're not doing any of those things. That chemical is going to increase. And depending on how you are functioning around that, then of course there are different things that you may see happening. The person may be snappy, they might be a little bit more aggressive than normal. Like this happy-go-lucky person is no longer interested about hanging out or Friday night dates or anything like that. They just don't want to talk. They don't want to engage. Things that they used to like before, they don't like. They're withdrawing, isolating, often feeling hopeless or helpless about whatever is happening with them. And that in itself is where persons will develop a mental illness. And of course, there are different contributors. Like, as I said, relationship ending, job situation. And very often there are a lot of demands on our job that are unrealistic.
Okay.
They're unrealistic.
Yeah.
There is no way that you can have an employee doing dual tasks with an expectation that this person is going to do 50% of those two tasks exceptionally well. It's just not going to happen. Especially when that person already has different things happening in their life. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And so that in itself, when employees, when our families, etc., are not very supportive, when there's that level of encouragement, etc., we have persons becoming, that hopelessness starts setting in. And sooner or later, we have persons who are just giving up.
So how much control then does an individual have over their mental health? Granted that circumstances, we may not have much control over the circumstances
Those we
that
know.
happen in your life. So then how do you manage and navigate that to maintain at least reasonable mental health?
So that's why we're having this conversation,
Yeah.
because it's through these conversations that persons will start understanding, okay, what I'm feeling isn't normal. This anxiety or my heart racing or my inability to sleep or me not going anywhere nowadays, not hanging out with my friends, that those things aren't normal. So when you start becoming aware that, okay, there's a shift here, and you're willing to talk to someone, you're willing to seek help, that is a control that you have. Okay. That is the ability, the power that you hold within your hands in terms of determining how are you going to practice self-care, because taking care of your mental health is actually a process of self-care.
Okay.
So that is the control that we have, taking the time to reflect and take care of ourselves.
So how what are some of the ways that we can practice self-care?
So setting dates with your friends, close friends, connecting with, doing what you love. So for example, if you like to dance, you join a dance class or you put on some music and you take at least 20 minutes in your home to do so. Because some persons might say, I don't have the money to go to dance class, but you can dance in your home. Persons could do the whole going to the sauna. Sauna is actually a good way of detoxing the body as well and helping you balance some of the chemicals as well too. And we have 2-3 saunas in Antigua?
Yeah.
Right? So there are different ways. You could do a massage. You could start eating differently. A lot of times, a lot of people don't recognize also that how they eat is also contributes to an imbalance in chemicals in the body. So even some of us are eating high starch food when we should really be eating more protein. Even if you're vegan, your intake should be protein-based fats. So that way it assists you in being able to even manage your chemical imbalances differently. 20 years ago, people weren't talking about PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome. It happens a lot in women. I'm glad that 20 years later, that's a conversation that has been normalized, because guess what? a lot of women with PCOS have depression because it messes with the hormone imbalance in your body. So regular health checkups as well is also important, and a lot of us fail to go to our doctors. So those are just some of the ways that persons can take their mental health, taking care of themselves, a priority in terms of being able to take care of their mental health.
I think what happens sometimes, individuals may feel guilty spending time, spending money on themselves. I do believe that happens in some cases, especially when you have demanding circumstances, people depending on you, and you don't want to disappoint folks. So underscore the importance of really, again, reflecting on yourself and taking care of yourself.
But one of the things I want to ask is this, though. What happens when you're no longer here? Who's going to take care of those same persons that you are making those sacrifices or feeling guilty about not being able to take care of? Your ability or the quality of you being able to take care of those around you depends on the quality time and effort you spend on yourself.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes. Sir.
So we have to get to that place. And I think it's also culture, because there is this underlining thinking, and I think more often than not now, there are lots of persons who are extremely entitled. And so we very often take care of, we're afraid to say no. We're afraid, what is that going to mean? How am I going to be looked at? What is that going to mean if I say no to somebody? But at the end of the day, the question is, how long do you want to be here for? And if the answer to that is you have a 3-year-old, you have a 1-year-old, you have a parent who is going to need you, etc., then there has to be some aspect of you prioritizing yourself in order to do all those things. So you have to spend time in reflecting, meditating, quiet time, relaxation, going to the beach. We're 365.
Yeah.
Right? We're 365 beaches. So we don't even have an excuse as to why we don't do things that require us just spending time with ourselves, and they don't cost money. Sure. So going to the beach doesn't cost money. Going to the beach doesn't cost money. Unless you and a group of friends are going to plan this whole shebang of going on the beach. But it doesn't have to be an event. It could just be, once you have a vehicle, once you have access to a ride, a bus, there's so many beaches that are accessible by buses. So we have options. Very often we do limit ourselves by looking only at our limitations as opposed to the possibilities. And the possibilities are endless.
Yeah. Now, let's come back to something we touched on earlier. What are some of the ways that work in particular can impact on your mental wellness, both in the very obvious ways and maybe the less obvious ways as well?
You know, a lot of workplaces have bullies.
Wow. Yeah.
A lot of workplaces have bullies. And sadly, some of the bullies are extremely smart, extremely sophisticated, and they have the backing of a lot of persons. And as a result of that, they feel untouchable. And so they prey on persons who may feel uncertain about the job, their ability to, in terms of, are they doing well? They may have gotten a negative review from their bosses. Some of their bosses are not confidential. So you're having those conversations in settings where persons are going to sense that something was said or something might slip at some point in time. And that in itself creates a toxic environment. So the toxicity starts because, one, we have a bully. Two, and we don't practice ethical considerations for others. We talk about everything. We talk about each other. And that is what I find to be the most popular starting or foundation of creating toxic work environments. Because I can't trust you as leadership. I'm coming, being vulnerable, expressing something. Maybe it was something about my review. Maybe it was something I had a conversation with you about, but nothing was being done, etc. And next thing I hear it from the person next door to me having a conversation with somebody else. And so we as employers, employee we have to decide what are or what type of environment we want to foster for persons to work in. So those are the not so obvious ones, right? And then we have, as I said, unreasonable expectations.
Yeah.
Now, you know that you have given, might be a small company, you have now, because you don't have enough human resource, etc. So you may say, hey, can you handle XXXX while handling that? I can give you maybe $300 to do that. But it doesn't mean that because you're giving me the $300 that it is realistic of the individual to be able to do those things
Okay.
well.
Okay.
Right? And so you're hammering on them, you didn't meet this quota, you didn't do this, you didn't do that. What does that do for your employer when they go home to their own families? I mean, most persons aren't able to compartmentalize. Let's just be honest about that.
Yeah.
Not all of us are great at doing that. So they're walking home with the work stress. They're engaging with their own families. They're engaging with their children. They might even shut down completely because the day was too heavy. And then that creates a whole plethora of other social issues. And so we don't realize half the time that sometimes the environments we create, the realistic environments we create for persons to work in, is going to determine how effective they are even as just an individual. How many, whether it be governmental, civil service entities, etc., have therapists? How many? Jill, how many?
I don't get the impression that it's a priority. Yeah.
It's not. And I remember the first time when I came back home, that was something that I would have presented to a lot of entities and I did not hear back from them. So here it is. You have a toxic work environment. Your employees have no place to vent that unless they're going into their minimum wage to pay a clinician, a therapist, etc. And that's unfair because it is not their fault that the environment created this situation for them. So we too, as employers, have to take some responsibility for the type of trauma our workers are exposed to and what type of support are we willing to offer.
So tell us a bit about the support that's out there for some of us who may not be aware.
They're like, what? There are approximately, I'm sure, at least 5 clinicians in Antigua now. And they're like over 100, I'm sure, and I could be exaggerating, but let's be on the safe side, there are at least 30 practicing clinical social workers and clinical counselors or counseling psychologists, if we're being outright. So you have the clinical social workers and you have counseling psychologists. So there are entities that we can tap into. The problem is, I'm saying a session costs $100. Yeah, $100 saying back to somebody. But you happily pay that to your doctor and more. Who's going to send you for tests that cost you $1,500. And half of the problems that you're having are psychological based.
Yeah. So I think maybe sometimes people have reservations about seeing a clinician, about speaking, maybe because they haven't had any sort of exposure to that environment. So typically, what happens when you see a therapist, a clinician, about your mental health? Perhaps we could offer some guidance along that line.
Okay, so if you're going to see a clinician, a clinical social worker, or a counseling psychologist, typically there's an intake process. So your first session is not necessarily going into fully what your issues are. It is going to be an intake process to basically create an idea as to what your traumas may have been, your exposure to different situations may have happened in your life, your historical aspect in terms of are there persons within your family that have a mental health issue. Most of the times we say no, but then if you ask the person, how many times you heard somebody in your family had a nervous breakdown? Because that was the clause that we used a lot when persons had mental health issues. And you find that persons start opening up when you say something. Depending on what the person is saying that they're feeling, you may do an assessment as a part of your intake process. So your assessment, some of us may run a BEC, which is a depression index. Some of us may run a BASC, especially for our under 18 population. So there are different things that are going to happen on your first time going in. Now, you're going to discuss your goals, because even though you're going to see someone, they want to know what is it that you're hoping to achieve from coming to your 6 to 12 sessions, right? And they may even add in and ask, how do you feel about adding this to your goals, etc. If you say this is something that we can work on based on XXXXX. So those are some of the things that happen, especially in your first session. And then the sad part is very often we don't recognize how to get to the resilient part of us, and going to a therapy session is basically finding out what your strengths are and maximizing those so you can cope throughout your daily life. That's basically what coming to a therapist is.
Now, I'm coming back to something you touched on earlier as well. Talk to us a bit about how mental health intersects with gender, age, and perhaps even socioeconomic backgrounds. Are the experiences different across these various intersections?
To some extent, based on our socioeconomic background, it might be. And it goes back to the conversation we have about the biological background, the historical aspect of a person. So within a person's socioeconomic background or history, if there is a history of mental health issues, you may find that they will quicker call a psychiatrist to come into the home and assess the family person, getting them the support. Whereas in our lower socioeconomic strata, they're like, man up, figure it out. That type of, because there is not that same level of awareness that exists within persons who have greater access to resources versus those who do not. The approaches are different. So in terms of addressing those needs, how a person in higher stratus of society engages with mental health is completely different. Now, when we talk about aspects concerning mental health as relates to gender, a man is quicker to successfully commit suicide than a woman. A woman will make attempts seeking help. That's basically their way of crying out for help for addressing the issues. But a man, when he feels extremely hopeless and that there's absolutely nothing going for him, he is going to find the most finite way of ending it. So for men, they usually hang, or they usually use a gun, or they use a poison that is definitely going to work. So very, very often or than not, how a man commits suicide or deals with mental health is completely different, because again, depending on where we fall in our status, whereas middle to lower income may say man up, because they don't have the education or the awareness of how to seek those resources. And then of course, I mean, I'm grateful for Dr. Joseph, because she is one of the most reasonable persons you can go to in terms of getting psychiatric support, whereas other persons' cost is exorbitant and not many persons are able to access those resources depending on their income. So in terms of how, the approach is completely different. And for the gender, in terms of when they have found that space where they feel that there's absolutely nothing going for them, a woman's approach is completely different. Our older population is going to be a lot different in terms of what it may come out as. With our 5 to 13, we may find that they have a lot of psychosomatic symptoms, meaning they may complain about being dizzy, they may complain about being hot, they may complain about having chest pains, they may complain about breathing issues.
Okay, so as we begin to wind down, we'll come back to the work environment. What can folks do to, because I know you mentioned earlier that in some instances, individuals, workers have to deal with what's called a toxic working environment. Might not have much control over that. So how you have to go to work. So how do you cope? How do you navigate a toxic working environment?
So the answer to that may be a little difficult because it's going to be dependent on the person's need for financial stability. A lot of persons stay in working environments because they have a mortgage to pay, they have a car note to pay for, they have children to take care of. And so what I would say to persons is to do better self-care for themselves in terms of taking care of themselves. When you have those weekends when you're away from the office, find ways to de-stress, healthy ways to de-stress. So I don't mean alcohol, I don't mean sex, I don't mean, when I say that, I shouldn't say it that way. Not promiscuous
Yes,
sexual
yes.
activity.
Yeah, and risky.
And risky sexual activities. I mean, be very specific about that.
Yeah.
And when I say alcohol, I'm talking about binging, that way you're drinking to feel numb, to escape. Those are not healthy ways of coping. A lot of persons now do the whole, you can have 15 grams on you now. And so as a result, a lot of persons are smoking. What I don't realize a lot of people are not aware of is that the healthiest way to use marijuana isn't smoking. Any type of smoke will have an impact on your health at some point in time. So if you're going to use your marijuana as a way of calming or whatever the case is, ensure that you're finding healthy ways to use your THC. Okay, I can't tell you not to,
Yeah.
because I find that sometimes when we tell people not to, it's like, let me go try it. So what I would say is, if you're going to use the hookahs and whatever, I noticed those cultures have become extremely popular within Antigua and Barbuda, ensure that you're utilizing healthy uses of whatever, if it's alcohol or if it's THC. Find good, healthy balances. If you're recognizing that you're depending on these things to feel good, it's time to talk to somebody. When you recognize you cannot disconnect and enjoy being in the presence, but you're bombarded by flashbacks or heart palpitations, etc., it's time to talk to somebody. Support for parents who have children, especially if they have special needs. There is no normal day for that person. That in itself has its own stressors, especially if you're dealing with a severely autistic child or a child on the spectrum who you have not gotten an assessment for, who is nonverbal, who may make different decisions and may be extremely impulsive. There has to be some type of support that we are willing to give families who have children with special needs. And I think sometimes employers are not, and I might probably get in trouble for this, but I'm okay with trouble, is that very often we want to paint everybody with the same brush. Somebody may have more support in terms of family support, so it doesn't impact them the same way. Whereas another person might be the only parent trying to support or provide interventions in these situations. And so we also need to be able to know our workers, to be able to adjust and support based on the different needs and not just what's on your books, because everybody's not coming to you the same way. And so there needs to be some type of empathy that is, even if it's not in your regulations, if it's not in your book, that you as a manager can implement internally. And very often I feel as if we sometimes treat people as if they're robots, show up and work. But the quality of the work that you're going to get from your employee is based on the quality of support that you give them.
Absolutely. A very important and profound note as we begin to wind down our conversation. So what is the key thoughts or the key takeaway messages that folks can remember when it comes to mental health and even as it relates to being in the workplace?
Self-care is the best care. Take care of yourself first, prioritize you, and then you can take care of everybody else. That's the only takeaway I want to leave today.
All right. Again, I want to thank you, Fiona, for spending time with us and giving us some deeper insight into mental health and how it relates to many workers across this country and the world. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me.